everybody, and thanks to the library for having me here. I was a journalist for many years, and writing a book was always on my bucket list. I had always thought it would probably be a biography. I love doing research, and so I was quite sure it would be at least nonfiction. Certain events in my life altered what the final outcome was to be and what I would write. The Seventh Shot is a story of the 30-year hunt for the .22 caliber killer, Ronald Glenn West, a former Metro Toronto cop. I wrote this particular story for two reasons. First of all, I experienced an incident back in the early 1990s. I was a coordinator at a rural learning centre in Honeywood, Ontario, northern Mulmer in Dufferin County, and there was an attempted murder happened across the street. It started out as a domestic, and a woman was severely injured, and I managed to get her out of the house and away, and we brought her to the centre and got help and so on. And I went on for a couple of years where I had to go to court and be a witness and give interviews and so on. Ultimately received a commendation from the OPP and the Governor General and so on. So it was huge. Oh, and by the way, this fellow happened to be an ex-cop. So all that aside, and post-traumatic stress disorder, long taken care of, in the late 90s, I ran into an old school friend who was my accountant by then, and he said to me, "Do you remember a fellow by the name of Ron West in our grade 12 class?" And I did vaguely. He was creepy. That's all I could remember. It's an awful thing to say, but I was a teenager, and that's how he came across as creepy. He said, well, he became a Metro Toronto cop, and they have just charged him with murdering two women back in 1970 while he was a cop. It was like a 30-year-old cold case. So as I got closer to retirement, it just seemed, even though I'd started already gathering research on a Canadian war hero at the time, I just thought, I think I was meant to do this story. And the fact that also that I felt I might have a little easier access to information through the OPP, because I had a bit of a record in a nice sense with them, and that's what I did. So over a period of 5 years, I put this book together and went through lots of archives and so on, and it was pretty much 5 years in the making. By the time I turned 73 last year, the book came out, and it's been doing quite well, and I do have quite a large police following, actually, because even though it's a very sad story, at the same time, it's a story about these police officers that for 30 years, amongst them, managed to bring this fellow to justice, and at a great cost to them, and their respect and their care for the victims' families over all those years. I still hear from the victims' families saying, God bless those people. God bless them for finally bringing this to us. So, having said that, there's definitely some local elements to the book. I'm sure that some of you may even know Wayne Frechette. No kidding. Okay. He was a long-time OPP officer. Then he served, I think, from 2000 to 2010 as the police chief for Barrie. He lives here still in Innisfil. He's a part of the case over the years. In fact, it comes up several times through his time. Also, the late Chief Don Hillock of York Regional Police. He was the Chief of Police for York Region. He was one of the main detectives over the years. In fact, he was the first officer on at the first site as a very young man, and did an incredible job of securing the site. Another one would be retired now, Detective Inspector Don McNeil. He at one time headed up the OPP detachment in Alliston. He's now retired, living in Aurelia. And not a police officer, although I believe he was once. You may know Gord Walkout. He was in that same class with my accountant, myself, and Ron West, so he would have remembered him as well. So I think what I'll do is I'm going to read a little bit from the book, a segment, and later on, if you have any questions or anything, I'm going to be here and be happy to speak with you. So just to set this for you. It was Wednesday, May the 6th, 1970, on Bethesda Side Road in Gormley, Ontario. And the mother, Doreen, and her 19-month-old son were at home. Slightly later, at what was estimated to be after 10 a.m., a stranger pulled up to the tidy little house and emerged from his vehicle. He strode deliberately up the gravel path lined with tulips and daffodils, which faded in the shelter of a split rail fence. The stranger couldn't help but see the ride-on toys and the unmistakable signs of a home occupied by a busy toddler. This was a house of light and laughter. The stranger was clean-cut, of medium height, with average features save for somewhat large ears, and most probably dressed in his favorite combination of checkered shirt, short jacket, and slacks. Many who knew the stranger would later reflect that he could blend into almost any environment, that he was simply unremarkable and often passed as almost invisible, a ghost, they would say. Doreen had no reason to feel any undue concern when the stranger knocked on the door, a door that was rarely locked. It is not known what the stranger said to gain entry. It would later be postulated that he may have asked to use the phone, or perhaps concocted a more elaborate ploy. Whatever was said, gain entry he did, and no doubt gained Doreen's immediate cooperation by brandishing a .22 caliber handgun. He possibly used Brent, the little fella, and the suggestion of harm to either him, her, or both of them in order to gain her submission. What followed would inspire nightmares for both those who loved and barely knew her. Doreen was brutally raped in the bedroom, and later, after being allowed to partially dress and pick up Brent, perhaps believing her nightmare may be coming to an end, stopped in her tracks by 2 bullets to the back, sending her to the floor and partially paralyzing her. It was later determined that as she attempted to crawl away with Brent still in her arms, the stranger fired 5 more shots into the back of Doreen's head. She held her hands up in an instinctive attempt to protect herself, and both index fingers were shot through. Brent was unharmed, but he was pinned beneath her. The stranger could hardly have avoided the confused eyes of the little boy trapped beneath his mother as these additional shots were fired. 3 additional shots were fired. Locking the front door behind him, the stranger was careful to leave as little evidence of himself as possible, even though the use of DNA was not yet in practice. As the stranger, the monster, backed down the gravel driveway, mother and child remained behind, Doreen's lifeless body securing her son's body safely to her, even in death. That is a very grim part of the book, but when you realize, as you read the book, how many officers carried this vision and others with them for all these years and just made it a point of their life that they were going to bring this man to justice. And that's why I say it's worth understanding the outcome and what they go through. And I think it's been a great model to the young officers I hear from that have read it and find it quite inspiring. So thank you for your time, and if you have any questions or...
I do. Was the guy who was ultimately caught a suspect initially?
Never, not for a moment, no, never. And they had other, it's funny because there were other suspects until they, there was one fellow who went to Penetang, I believe, and they thought for the longest time that he looked more like the sketch than the actual person did that the sketch was of. So he was doomed to be considered a suspect. But he wasn't, they found out ultimately. There were a number, but no one had a clue, and it was very fluky how it all came about. But I don't want to give too much away. But thank you. And like I said, if you have any other questions, thank you very much.